Hello, my Hegelians. Welcome to another episode of Hegel and Bagels. Today we're going to start our first part of a three-part series on the ethics of ambiguity, and that is because Simone de Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity is divided into three parts, plus a conclusion, which we'll look at the end of part 3. So, Simone de Beauvoir lived from 1908 to 1986. She published The Ethics of Ambiguity in 1947, and soon that was followed up by the book that I would say most people, at least in my field, know her by, which is The Second Sex, which was published in 1949. Now, the 40s was an important decade for women in France because in France, women received the right to vote in 1944, whereas, of course, in the U.S., it was 1920 in the 19th Amendment. So the ethics of ambiguity comes after Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, which was published in 1942, and Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which was published the year after in 1943. Now, I mention these because Simone de Beauvoir, in the first part of her book, situates her thesis within Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and she doesn't mention Camus, at least not yet. I can't remember if she does later on. I don't think so, but we'll see. Sometimes I wonder why isn't everyone who can, why don't they refer to Camus? Because Camus is also talking about this. Because I think that, her main issue, as we'll see with Sartre and existentialism, is that an ethics is currently lacking, or it's just in its nascent stage. It's not developed. There's a lot of misconceptions about, and I guess paths that you could take in existentialism that might sort of cancel out ethics on its most significant, meaningful kind of potentiality. And Camus, even though I don't think he also perhaps has an explicit ethics or a fully formed ethics, he is grappling with it. That's what he's grappling with throughout the entire book. But nevertheless, she brings up Sartre, she brings up Kierkegaard, Hegel, Marx, tangentially Kant, Husserl, and Descartes. But mainly the first part kind of looks at the historical problem of ethics in existentialist thought history. So she's kind of setting up sort of the stage for her thesis by looking at what is problematic in these philosophers, basically. Then how part 1 is structured. So there's this historical part, mainly talking about or referring to Kierkegaard, Sartre, and Hegel. And then she has about 5 pages in this that rather perplexingly talks about Marx. This is the one part of part 1 that I don't completely understand, and therefore I think it would be a good space to sort of, if you can get an ambiguous see an ambiguous part where it could be interpreted various ways, or it's just hard to interpret, which I think her commentary on Marx is, and maybe isn't in some ways. We'll get to it. That's always a good section to look at when you're thinking about, like, if you're in college and you're writing a paper, an essay, go to the confusing part and try to make it less confusing, or offer, some interpretations to it. And then she kind of sums up her chapter, or this first part, after she talks about Marx, she kind of goes back to just talking about her thesis in general, and she starts getting into a little bit discussion of oppression, because we have to remember that Simone de Beauvoir, she's about to write The Second Sex, or she's probably in the midst of thinking and writing about it already, and this is kind of the essential text of second wave feminism that looks at women's place in relation to men and kind of advocates for women to become her own agent, her own person, and looks at gender in a socially constructed way, saying that one, is not a woman but becomes a woman according to what society dictates for her. And so she is going to... So it's no surprise that what she's doing here in this text is comparing absolute freedom to concrete freedom. Because she, as a person who wants to help women in their liberation, in their evolution as agents, as individuals, is going to be very interested in the concrete and the particular. And that's where she sees this focus on only the absolute side of freedom in existentialism that existentialists, male existentialists, mainly focus on. This is where she sees like all the problems kind of happening, and why people readers of existentialism may think that may lead to despair or masking the absurdity by falling into various ideas or paths that are more certain, like religion, etc., or reject life altogether and suicide. So there are these various, or maybe she doesn't bring up Nietzsche, at least she hasn't yet, she doesn't in this part, but Nietzsche, his apparent, from my reading, response to our absurd relationship to a silent world when human beings need answers and want answers, is to sort of create your own individual path. Nietzsche, I kind of see him now as sort of apolitical or not in the political realm. He doesn't necessarily... it would be problematic if we applied, I think, his ideas to politics and to the wider space of human beings and communities. But I think also probably he also intends, he says his philosophy is for the few. So it's not for everyone. He wants to overcome certain weaknesses just individually, I think. So Simone de Beauvoir is going to want to lean toward ethics that have a universal sort of ring to it, because as we will see as we get into this, she says that there are, even if there's not a blueprint, even if there's not sort of a moral dictate from an external being, we are in the world, we're connected to the world, our freedom is connected to the world, and so there are preferable worlds, and so, of course, and in her mind, she is going to prefer a world where women are no longer oppressed and limited in their particularities, so that they can rise to the potential of their both absolute and concrete freedoms. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. I know that was kind of a long introduction, and if we want to, just one more thing actually, I guess we should say, a few more things, is that Betty Friedan, if you're interested in feminism, Betty Friedan wrote published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, so this was, a little more than The Second Sex was more than a decade previous to that. And if you want to look at feminism historically, it's historically divided up into waves. So especially when you look at, and again, feminism kind of evolved and manifested itself differently depending on what sort of geographical region you're talking about. So now I'm kind of going back to, I guess it overlaps. Some of these elements or these divisions can be maybe applied to particular places globally, but I'm just kind of speaking from, the U.S. and American feminism. That's my confidence doesn't really extend beyond that when I'm talking about this. So especially for women in the U.S., the first wave feminism was the need to, or the desire to be allowed to vote. And so you think about like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were kind of in this conversation, creating this conversation, leading this conversation. There is a wonderful text called The Woman's Bible that kind of shows how religion enters into this and how they see that a particular patriarchal interpretation of the Christian scriptures needs to be overcome, needs to be surpassed, and in order for women to have more say in the world. And then second wave was mainly focused on women working. This was, again, looking at the U.S., Betty Friedan in the 60s. That's really what the feminine mystique was. She was talking about mainly to middle-class white women who didn't usually work. So there were, of course, women who were forced to work and had to work to survive. But she's really talking to like the 1950s housewife, saying that, well, she needs agency. She needs to go out of the house and be able to work and have her own career. And then third wave is generally connected to the 90s, talking about sexism, especially in consumerism, like women being objectified in the media and in news and for companies, looking at gender identity and how women need to go beyond just the body and her sexualized identity. And then fourth wave really gets into, social media, the Me Too movement, body shaming, rape culture. And then we are said to be in the fifth wave, which I think that this may change as time goes on, because the most recent wave is often about just that feminism has gone beyond gender and looks to the marginalization of all peoples. That's what they said about the fourth wave until we realized what the fourth wave is really about. So now we're saying it about the fifth wave, and who knows if that'll change. But it might stick. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this. So feel free to get your tea, get your coffee, settle in, and we're going to start this off with a story time. So the beginning of the Ethics of Ambiguity starts out with part 1, called Ambiguity and Freedom. And she starts out with a quote that says, "From the moment we are born, we begin to die." And so here, this is what she says, sort of, jumping off from that. "Man knows and thinks this tragic ambivalence with the animal and the plant merely undergo. A new paradox is thereby introduced into his destiny. Rational animal, thinking reed. He escapes from this natural condition." So this quote, "From the moment we are born, we begin to die." So that's a part of the absurdity of the human existence that we share with all of nature, right? Because we are not immortal, we can't live forever, we have limited control over our world. And then we also suffer because there's aging and there's disease and then there's death. And so she's saying that, and historically, philosophers have tried to transcend our sort of bodily existence, which seems to be the reason and cause for our pain and suffering and displeasure. And so we think of ourselves in the spiritual plane as a thinking, rational being. And in this way, we might be able to find sort of this godlike freedom and existence, which, again, Simone de Beauvoir is going to say is very problematic because you can't forget about the body. You can't forget about our actual daily living. Okay, so he escapes from his natural condition without, however, freeing himself from it. He is still a part of this world of which he is a consciousness. He asserts himself as a pure internality against which no external power can take hold. And he also experiences himself as a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. At every moment, he can grasp the non-temporal truth of his existence. But between the past which no longer is and the future which is not yet, this moment when he exists is nothing. This privilege, which he alone possesses, of being a sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects, is what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collectivity on which he depends. Okay, so far she is kind of saying that, so this is the attempt that people have often kind of made in trying to transcend our bodily existence, but it's still ambiguous because it's like we know inside that we are free, like no one, I guess, excepting, brainwashing, etc., can control our minds. We're free inside, even if we're not free on the outside. But it's still an ambiguous state because you can't necessarily really transcend your bodily existence. I mean, I guess some people would just protest that or disagree with it, but she's saying that there's ambiguity, but it's mostly just problematic that people are trying to do this. As long as there have been men and they have lived, they have all felt this tragic ambiguity of their condition. But as long as there have been philosophers and they have thought, most of them have tried to mask it. They have striven to reduce mind to matter, or to reabsorb matter into mind, or to merge them within a single substance. Those who have accepted the dualism have established a hierarchy between body and soul, which permits of considering as negligible the part of the self which can not be saved. And so this is a big idea in feminism, that there is just the awareness that when you have a dualism, the components of that dualism are set up in a hierarchical relationship where one becomes the sort of superior entity and the other one is ignored, silenced, or considered not important, or considered impure, or something like that. And so, of course, women men are situated in their bodies as well, but sort of, I would guess, second wave feminism, let's say, since Simone de Beauvoir is in that camp, is really going to, and third wave feminism really emphasizes the bodily existence of women and how, feminist theologians also kind of critique this aspect of Christianity that so much is focused on the mind and the spirit and the soul, but women live in our bodies and have babies and things like that, so, and are sexualized and all these things. And so in order to liberate women, we need to celebrate the body. That is kind of the second wave and third wave message. So I think this is really interesting how she is, trying to set up the issue so that she can then say that, we're only falling into despair. It's only problematic because of the focus on absolute freedom. But there's also a freedom of the concrete, which people, I think she would say, don't really want to focus on because that's hard work, right? So making the world better in a concrete way for everybody and for ourselves, isn't it more comforting and consoling to just say, well, that's not really our responsibility, and we can just try to, breathe and set ourselves apart and transcend. So kind of like, I guess, British Romanticism as well. And I guess this was like something, an element in the Enlightenment, this whole emphasis of rationality. And then she's saying, hold on, like, this isn't really going to create a world that is preferable. You can't wait until you die to kind of live the life that you imagine will be there in the afterlife, and then you can't kind of check out of life. So this is what she is going to say. She says, just skipping just a sentence or two, and the ethics which they have proposed to their disciples has always pursued the same goal. It has been a matter of eliminating the ambiguity by making oneself pure inwardness or pure externality. So she's saying, like, no, we are body, baby. That's what we are. And I mean, I guess we can see some correlates in Camus, because Camus is not saying this, right? I mean, he is saying that we should not, and many existentialists would say, actually, that we should not eliminate our ambiguity, that we should embrace and confront the absurd. That's Camus' biggest argument against committing suicide, is that, and that's why he, the whole idea of the myth of Sisyphus, he's like, the most sacred image of facing the absurd and pressing on regardless of the absurdity of the world. And of course, the world is absurd because the kind of being that we are is the type of being that wants answers, but then the universe just won't give it up. The universe is silent. Like, we don't know and may never know and can't find, why are we here? What is the purpose of our lives? What should we be focusing on? Like, is this a great test? Is this, boot camp for another level? Are we going to have reincarnation and come back and, progress in levels? Is our faith trying to be tested so that we can enter in through the gates of heaven? Like, what are we trying, or, basically like Plato and Socrates, is it our role to be great philosophers during life so that we can engage with the gods and former philosophers when we die? But Camus is saying that, this idea of continually rolling a rock up a hill, a stone up a hill, knowing that it'll come back down, and you have to just keep rolling it up, and there's not really a goal. Like, this is just what it is, a repetitious kind of cyclic kind of existence. But to say, well, that's fine, like, bring it on, like, this is what we're doing. That Camus is saying, embrace the absurd. So I don't think that necessarily de Beauvoir is completely fair in not recognizing that there have been existentialists, or at least philosophers, regardless of whether they call themselves existentialists or not, or whether we do or not, that have said, yes, the world is absurd, the world is full of suffering, but let's just press on. Like, we need to press on. So I don't necessarily think that, she could kind of flesh this out a little bit. And then she goes on to Hegel and say that Hegel, well, he takes a step above this. She says, Hegel with more ingenuity tried reject none of the aspects of man's condition. But then he tried to reconcile them all, basically because Hegel was, if you read Hegel, he kind of looks at like slavery, and he kind of looks at war and different oppressions as, well, they happened, and maybe they were even essential to helping us evolve as a human species into a higher consciousness. He talks about, like, for instance, the slave and the master, and how the slave, if you are a slave who can transcend your ego because you're put in a place where you see the differences and are suffering by the differences. But whereas the master, living in his oblivious, privileged life, doesn't really transcend the ego as well. So he tries to so Hegel gets into the realm of justifying everything that happens, and Simone de Beauvoir isn't really about this, because she says in the same paragraph as when she's talking about Hegel, she says, one can thus repose in a marvelous optimism where even the bloody wars simply express the fertile restlessness of the spirit. So she's kind of taking a jab at Hegel, that is not a nice privileged perspective to have, it's okay, the atomic bomb, it had to happen, and it progressed us regardless, or it was a happy error, or whatever, she's not accepting that. And so she calls it a stubborn lie, this perspective. So moving on, I'm on page 8 now. I guess I'll tell you what pages I'm on, because I'm kind of just going through it, and I've marked several passages to highlight. So on page 8, she says, in spite of so many stubborn lies, at every moment, at every opportunity, the truth comes to light. The truth of life and death, of my solitude and my bond with the world, of my freedom and my servitude, of the insignificance and the sovereign importance of each man and all men. So she does this a couple of times, tries to, locates the significance of the human existence in her own subjectivity, or in one's subjectivity, but not like the sort of individual, sort of narcissistic, I guess, movement of the philosophies and philosophers that she's opposing. It's a subjectivity that's tied to universality, and this is what she's fleshing out. This is what she says Sartre starts to do and has potential to do, but he doesn't really get there. So now she actually starts talking about Sartre, and she says Sartre, in being in nothingness, fundamentally defined man, that being whose being is not to be. That subjectivity, which realizes itself only as a presence in the world, that engaged freedom, that surging of the for oneself, so the individual, we're making our own choices, doing our own thing, because there's no absolute morality, which is immediately given for others. Because basically, Sartre says in Being in Nothingness that when we enjoy our own freedom, when we make choices for ourselves, we are affecting others. We are creating a way and making a way through maybe our example, other people to enjoy their freedom. But Simone de Beauvoir, so this is kind of a beginning of ethics, but it's but she calls it an empty subjectivity. Because if you think about it, de Beauvoir is not going to really accept this and say that that's the end of it. Because, okay, so when I do something for myself and I'm saying, I'm going to take a day of self-care, maybe those around me will say, oh yeah, I'm going to take a day of self-care. But who cannot take a day of self-care? Who's not going to see that message? Who's not going to be having, an hour to scroll on Instagram to see that message? it doesn't go, that's sort of your choice in a sense, just in your daily living and your empty subjectivity, de Beauvoir says, I guess, it doesn't go very far, right? It goes maybe to the outer edges of your circle, of your social class, of your, space. But is it going to help people not in your class and your social space? Is it really is that an activist position for the world? It's like minimally helpful, I guess. So she says that we can't just have this perspective that we can do whatever we want because there's no God. Because she says, well, then where is the ethics? Again, going back to her problem, what she sees as a problem. She says, this is on page 9, one does not offer an ethics to a God. It is impossible to propose any to man if one defines him as nature, as something given. So she really says that, we should not think of ourselves as, this like eternal being that has transcended morals, or that can't have morals, that needs to create one. I mean, she does talk about agency, but I think it's really important that she's kind of dethroning human beings, mostly men who have spoken with authority on philosophy. She's like, you're not a god, so you need some ethics, basically. Okay, so she says, one of the last things she says about Sartre, her lover, she says that, and this is what pretty much everyone agrees with when they read Being and Nothingness. She says on page 10, it is only in the last pages that he opens up the perspective for an ethics. So, and that's true, and he never really fleshes it out. So that is what she kind of is seeing as her role. So moving on, we're kind of getting close to when she's going to talk about Marx, and so I don't know how helpful I will be, but let's go ahead and get there. So she says that we must, basically, this is on 13, basically she's suggesting to us that we refuse to set up, we refuse to set up as absolutes the ends toward which my transcendence thrusts itself. And I think that although the sentence before, existentialist conversion does not suppress my instincts, desires, plans, and passions. So she's trying to move away from the solely, like, this is just my morality, my decisions affect me, can perhaps benefit others, this really individualistic take of existentialism, and she's trying to move it into the public realm because she wants to transform the public realm for women. And so she's saying that, yes, I'm taking my morality for the world in a sense from my own standpoint. And that's kind of what you're doing, right? From a feminist standpoint or any sort of standpoint from marginalization, that's marginalized. You're trying to kind of make suggestions to the world so that, certain people aren't oppressed. But she's also saying that she recognizes that her instincts, passions, desires, and plans, like, they should not move toward a rigid utopia. That's what I think she's saying here. I think she's saying like something pretty nuanced on page 13, kind of like almost as a little caveat, that it's not her saying that this is how it should be for everyone, but there's particular interests within the wider sort of agenda of creating a world that is preferable. I think that's kind of her phrase, right? So we could also say a world where, people aren't oppressed and people aren't harmed unnecessarily. And what I mean by that is that, people are reducing the harm. that we, instigate on others, because we can't necessarily have a completely harmless world, right? Although some religions and spiritualities do feel that we can, such as the Jains, in its traditional sort of structure, manifestation. Okay, so let's move on to page 14. Let's see. So here she gets into, I keep talking about this preferable kind of world and where we get our morals from. It is this understanding and acknowledgement that the world could be better for everyone. So she says on the bottom of 14, and the truth is that outside of existence, there is nobody. Man exists. For him, it is not a question of wondering whether his presence in the world is useful, whether life is worth the trouble of being lived. These questions make no sense. So she says, so her critique of existentialism so far is just that it's been wrapped up in these sort of existential questions, these metaphysical questions of, is life worth living? Is life not worth living? So she says it is a matter of knowing whether he wants to live, okay, and under what conditions. So again, she's trying to move us to the concrete. So she says on 15, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. This is kind of an idea that someone could get from existentialism. And she says, today's believers use this formula for their own advantage. To reestablish man at the heart of his destiny is, they claim, to repudiate all ethics. But she says, however, far from God's absence authorizing all license, the contrary is actually the case. We are abandoned on the world, and we bear responsibility for the world. So we should care even more. We should put even more stock into what we're doing. Okay, and there's just one more page before Marx. So she goes back to Hegel. She kind of returns to him and talks about how he doesn't go far enough. And then she says, an ethics of ambiguity will be one which will refuse to deny a priori that separate existence can at the same time be bound to each other, that their individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all. So she's saying that we can individually be free and still move toward a universally ethic world. Like, we all have divergent interests and desires. She feels that we can like hold those desires but still move toward a more ethical world for everyone. So we're gonna take a quick break, and then we'll move on to just what I can glean from this section on Marx and finish this part up. Welcome back, Hegelians. All right, so now let's get into, this starts on page 17. The whole section, or part 1, is about 30 pages. It ends on page 35, so we're kind of in the second part now. So she opens this part up by saying, before undertaking the quest for a solution, it is interesting to note that the notion of situation and the recognition of separation which it implies are not peculiar to existentialism. We also meet it in Marx. Okay, so this notion of situation. Situation kind of makes me think of, feminist Marxism and the idea of standpoint theory, which is basically the theory that wherever you are in the world, it helps you see more and less than other people from different standpoints. For instance, if I am living paycheck to paycheck, I am spending most of my time working, and I don't like my job, and I don't have a lot of money for extra things. I'm going to see the world, my attitude, my perspective of whatever economic system I'm under, and my government, and the gaps between I'm going to see gaps even, and know that they're a problem. I'm going to see that differently than someone who doesn't have to budget and just kind of enjoys life and does yoga and drinks matcha lattes and, maybe has a perspective of, like anyone can be anything they want. So it's not really, we don't need to feel sad for people who are in impoverished states because, they just work hard and be where I am today, or yeah. So that is standpoint theory. So standpoint theory really says that, hey, we need to listen to everyone, especially those people who are on the margins or oppressed, because they might be able to tell us something more about our world than we just kind of miss. And I think this is very true. So her first sentence in kind of looking at this just kind of makes, suggests to the reader that she's just going to talk about Marx very plainly and in a straightforward way, kind of like she has been Hegel and Sartre and all the others, and say, well, this is where, but maybe in a more positive way, because you would think that de Beauvoir would like Marxism, especially because he's talking about the notion of situation, and he's talking about rising against the status quo and rebelling and coming to consciousness for the working class, just like she wants women to come to consciousness and rise above their place and fight against the status quo. But it's not really just a 100% positive, like I'm in love with Marx and this is what this is what I'm going to take from his ideas. I think that when she talks about Marx, it is rather clear that she enjoys some of his ideas and then maybe rejects others of his ideas. And she has a particular reading of Marx. For instance, well, she says that Marx is like radical. He's into radical humanism. So there's that. But she says that Marx does not consider that certain human situations are in themselves absolutely preferable to others. It is the needs of people, the revolt of a class, which define aims and goals. It is from a rejected situation, in the light of this rejection, that a new state appears desirable. So, that was an interesting reading, I think, to me, because I could definitely read more Marx and am going to in the future. My encounter with him has been deep and impactful, but, not great in quantity, I would say. So the fact that she says Marx does not consider that certain human situations are in themselves absolutely preferable to others, that was surprising to me, because I would assume that Marx does have a very particular idea of what is preferable, but then maybe that helps me complicate my view. Do the working class want to become the bourgeoisie? Or, no, I don't think so. Maybe that isn't the preferable status. Maybe they just want to break down this whole, the whole structure of hierarchy, and then have everyone be more equal. But then that again is a human situation that's more preferable to others. And de Beauvoir has. And it seems like then, if she thinks this about Marx, she disagrees with Marx, because in my reading at least, and the most logical reading of de Beauvoir, is that there are human situations that are preferable to others. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm just not understanding this passage. And then she kind of just, I don't know. She's kind of just talking about Marxism and Marx, but not really giving, in my opinion, a very clear emotional indicator of what she likes and doesn't like about Marx, which is what I would like. I think the way she talks about Marx is the most confusing to try to understand, what her stance is. I mean, she says that Marx on page 20, Marx ridiculed the idea of a proletariat as opposed to a flesh and blood proletariat that one is dealing with. Like, de Beauvoir wants to deal with the flesh and blood. And it seems like she's saying here that Marx does as well. So, I don't know. Someone needs to read the section about Marx, which lasts until page 22, and then explain it to me. I don't think it really helps to Google Simone de Beauvoir and Marx because, I don't know. When I read those summaries, it doesn't seem to be as complicated as what is in this actual text. So I think what I can glean then, I guess, from this section is that she finds Marx contradictory. And there's also the fact of what, the difference between what Marx said and what Marx, what kind of socialism Marx is responding to and how Marx is different, and then what Marxists have claimed. It just seems a bit vague to me, but that could be, and I've read it multiple times, and I still, couldn't create a chart that says these are the things she likes about Marx and these are the things she doesn't, which is kind of what I want to know. But maybe that's not what she's doing at all. She's not trying to tell me what she likes and doesn't like about Marx. It's just that's what she did with the other philosophers before, so I expected it. And that's an easy way for me to think as well. So maybe that's not the way she wants me to think. So I don't know. Okay, but going on from that, so that is something that, if you follow me on anywhere, I don't know if you can leave comments on this podcast, but however you can get in touch with me, if you understand pages, what is this? Where does it start? Page 17 maybe? 17 to 22, let me know. Or can tell me what other places she talks about Marx. Maybe she does in the Second Sex. I have read the Second Sex, I think like 15 years ago, so I need to read it again and get another copy. Okay, so let's quickly go through the rest of this part one. So really what she says, she says very clearly that we are going to discover a principle of action whose range will be universal. So she is excited about the understanding and creating a universal ethics from the particular. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. I haven't articulated it like that before. I'm going to write that down. Wants to create a universal ethics from the particular. That's good. I like that. I mean, it's just it's really clear. Oh my gosh, that's just stars everywhere by this. That is what she's doing. That is what she's doing. Oh my gosh, I don't know why. I'm so thrilled to have that revelation right here. Okay. All right, so she says on page 24, these are just I just have a few little things highlighted. To will oneself moral and to will oneself free are one and the same decision. You are not, if you want to be free, you need to be moral. And I wonder if that's going to lead to, no one is free until all are free kind of a thing. So she says on page 25, she reminds us that our absolute freedom only appears to us as a pure contingency. So it is contingent on our absolute freedom. How meaningful it is really conditional on our concrete freedom. Which makes sense, because if she's thinking about the standpoint of a woman who is oppressed, can she have the full potential of all her, wonderful internal freedom and thinking and, musing over ideas and being theoretical, etc., if her life conditions do not present her with, let's say, harken back to Virginia Woolf, a room of one's own, right? It's like your concrete situation affects, and again, this is Marx, right? Because Marx said, people who in the working class, they do not have enough leisure time, and then the leisure time, if they had more leisure time, then they would spend it reading and producing art and being in community, etc., and not, like being so exhausted they have to eat and go to sleep, watch their kids, etc. So this is very in alignment with Marx. But I think that we should hesitate on saying de Beauvoir is just in 100% alignment with Marx, because I think she wants to create a nuanced critique of Marx and dialogue about Marx, conversation about Marx, reading of Marx. I think that she does. So I think that whenever we talk about the relationship of Simone de Beauvoir and Marx, we should acknowledge its complicated nature. And that's what I'm going to say after just reading the 5 pages where she's talked about him. Because if it were clear, it would be clear, and it's not clear. So, okay, so she says on page 27, it is only when the moments of his life, so a person's life, begin to be organized into behavior that he can decide and choose. This is so important, because again, I think she's going to, talk about in the second sex, and maybe later on, is that, again, this deals with the concrete situation, right? That you can really only choose, and this is the element of freedom that the existentialists like and want and are offering to us. That Sartre says there's no good decision, there's no bad decisions, you just make a decision and you make it good. So this is what you need to do to fulfill the gift of your freedom. You need to act. You need to just decide and choose. Don't let other people decide for you. Don't be passive. Don't perform and believe your performance. You need to act. But she's saying that you can only act when the moments of your life are organized into a behavior where you can decide and choose. And so if you're oppressed and you're limited in your life, you are told what to do, you can't choose. There's no options. Or if you're given an option, but in quotes, there's not really a good choice, right? So either you do this or you don't survive. I mean, that's not really a choice, right? I guess you could choose not to survive, but it's not really a good choice. Good options. Okay, so she says on 27 on the bottom, but this living confirmation cannot be merely contemplative and verbal. It is carried out as an act. So basically, we need to see everyone's freedom in real time. It says that, she refers to Descartes on 28. This is what Descartes expresses when he says that freedom of man is infinite, but his power is limited. And she talks about sort of the Stoics and passivity, which I find really helpful in giving a suggestion on how we can look at, the ideas of mindfulness and Buddhism and sort of this calming of our resistances so that we can, in an Eckhart Tollean fashion, say yes to the present moment. But how then do we affect change in the world if we're always like kind of like letting go of our own resistances and judgments and just like going with the flow, basically? So she says on 29, we could indeed assert our freedom against all constraint if we agreed to renounce the particularity of our projects. If a door refuses to open, let us accept not opening it, and there we are free, is what, someone would say. And then she responds, but by doing that, one manages only to save an abstract notion of freedom. It is emptied of all content and truth. So she's not satisfied with just an infinite, eternal, godlike, abstract freedom that we only experience within ourselves. She wants outer freedom. She wants the body to be free. She wants a better conditions in our world. And I love that. And she says on 31, which I feel like might be in response to Camus, the myth of Sisyphus, there is no more obnoxious way to punish a man than to force him to perform acts which make no sense to him. As when one empties and fills the same ditch indefinitely, when one makes soldiers who are being punished march up and down, or when one forces a schoolboy to copy lines. So she talks and she says later on 31 that, when the oppressor is a human freedom, then there is a negative aspect of revolt and not a positive one. So she says, let's go ahead and finish this up. Let's see if we can. So basically she's saying that you can't revolt against the absurd by being passive. Really, it's only achieved, and this is 32, in the definitive rejection of the imposed situation. Otherwise, suicide is the only way that you can revolt. So I think she has a different opinion of suicide than Camus, and I feel like she's kind of in the middle of Camus and Schopenhauer. Camus just completely rejecting it and being against it. Schopenhauer feeling it's a very viable option. And Simone de Beauvoir, like not feeling it's ideal, but feeling it's valid. So on 33, she says, it is only by prolonging itself through the freedom of others that it manages to surpass death itself and to realize itself as an indefinite unity. Later on, we shall see what problems such a relationship raises. Okay, so in putting this in context, she's talking again about those philosophers the male philosophers, basically, of the past and of certain camps of thought, who's saying that, we are just going to try to be as free as we can individually. And she's saying, well, you're going to barge into a lot of flying birds and harm them, basically, because she's saying that you can really only do that if you are using the freedom of others. If you are utilizing it yourself, not for their benefit, but for your benefit. You're taking advantage of other people by just taking a very individualistic and intrinsic view of freedom. And then she says that this is a problematic relationship between the individual and others. But she's not going to talk about it yet. Okay. And then she talks about how, she says at the bottom of 34, in a metaphysics of transcendence, in the classical sense of the term, evil is usually reduced to an error. But she says on 35, yet it is because there are real dangers real failures and real earthly damnation that words like victory, wisdom, or joy have meaning. So she wants to put back into our actions the weight of the impact and say that no, there actually can be real evil in the world. And that evil is in part oppressing women, I would say. We want to just be super reductive and refer back to the second sex. Okay, so that is the first part of this book. And I think you can see how amazing and wonderful and important this book is, because she's talking about ethics and ethical existentialism. She's grounding it. She's making it concrete. So I hope that you join me in the future for parts 2 and 3. They will be up eventually. And I hope that this gives you a good taste of this book and encourages you to pick it up and read it, because Simone de Beauvoir is an important existentialist philosopher.